You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today, on the 32nd edition of the Useless Information Retrocast, you'll hear about a man who returned to Italy decades after moving away, only to find out that the Roman ruins which he remembered from his youth, they had been torn down. What? I know what you're thinking. They tore down the Colosseum? No, it's still there. Clearly something else is going on here. And another story that I'll share with you is about a woman who refused to look at an airplane simply because she believed that mankind was unable to fly. Plus, you'll hear about a real electric chair that electrocuted itself. Well, all those stories, the question of the day, today's retro sponsor, and so much more. It's all coming up next on today's edition of the Useless Information Retrocast. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Today I'm excited to share with you what I believe is a fantastic retrocast. And if you just happen to be new here and unfamiliar with the podcast, let me just preface this by mentioning these are the shorter stories that I found while doing my research for my usual longer stories. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive right in with the first story that I've written for today. Now, I'm sure you've heard this expression. Back in 1789, Ben Franklin famously wrote that there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. And while he wasn't the first to pen those words, all of us, of course, are mortal, and we will someday succumb to the hands of time. So when 73-year-old Louisa Philligaud Johnson of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, passed away on February 21st of 1924, it really wasn't a newsworthy event. 5 tiny lines in the death section of the February 23rd edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer was all that she got. It read, quote, Johnson, Louisa Filler, February 21st, widow of Lawrence Johnson and daughter of the late Henry L. Gaw. Services at residence Northeast Corner 22nd and Spruce Street, Saturday, 11:30 a.m. Internment private, unquote. However, just days later when her will was filed with the Register of Wills on February 29th of 1924, her passing grabbed headlines all across the United States. And it really wasn't her death that captured the public's attention, it was one of the stipulations in that will. While the exact value of her estate was never disclosed, reports estimated her wealth as, quote, more than $200,000, unquote. That's more than $3.6 million today. In other words, she was quite well off. For example, the 1900 census shows that Louisa lived with her husband Lawrence, who was supposedly a farmer, and their only child Millicent. But they weren't alone. Their household also included 7 servants. They were a butler, a coachman, a groom, a maid, a cook, a chambermaid, and a laundress. That's 7 more servants than my wife and I have. But that got me thinking it's unlikely that their fortune came from farming alone. So I did some checking, and when 56-year-old Lawrence passed away on August 22nd of 1905, there was a brief 2-sentence mention of his burial also in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I have to tell you, there was no mention of him being a farmer there. Instead, he was described as having been, quote, a shipping commission merchant, unquote. I'm guessing that's where the money came from. Well, Lawrence Johnson passed away 18 years before his wife Louisa, so one would assume that she left the couple's fortune to their daughter Millicent. But sadly, that wasn't possible because Millicent had died at age 34 on June 4th of 1919. That was just one day after she gave birth to her daughter Nancy. So instead, Mrs. Johnson created 4 separate trust funds. There was one for her son-in-law, Rufus King Lenig, who was Millicent's husband, and one for each of their 3 daughters, her granddaughters, Millicent, Louisa, and of course the youngest, Nancy. What made headlines was the unusual condition attached to Lenig's trust, the father's trust. He would receive $100,000, which is over $1.8 million today, only if he agreed never to remarry. And if he did, his entire inheritance, all $100,000 of it, it would go to his daughters, who notably faced no such restrictions. As a little side note, I did check Ancestry, and all 3 daughters did marry in the 1930s and 40s. but sadly they've all passed on at this point. Now, there was one additional stipulation, and that was that Lenig was required to pay Louisa's brother-in-law, that's Alfred C. Johnson, $150 per month, which is around $2,700 per month today. But Lenig didn't have to pay that very long because Alfred Johnson died 4 years later. Which leaves us with one final question. Did Rufus King Lenig ever remarry? Again, according to Ancestry records, he passed away on January 25th of 1945 at the age of 70. And yes, he remained single for the rest of his life. Next up, we have story number 2. On March 24th of 1937, the Ohio House of Representatives, by a vote of 85 to 12, passed a bill that forbid women from working as bartenders anywhere within the state. Having already been passed by the Ohio State Senate, the bill was certain to be signed into law by Governor Martin L. Davey. I should add that there was an amendment aimed to prevent waitresses from serving drinks, but that was tabled. So what was the rationale for all of this? Well, the main reason was that women were both driving down wages and also taking away good-paying jobs from experienced male bartenders. According to Fred Rasser, a representative for the Bartenders Alliance, one of the sponsors of the bill, the typical weekly salary for a female bartender was between $12 and $14. Compare that with male bartenders were earning about double, $25 per week, or around $540 per week today. And by letting women into the workforce, bartender wages were being driven down. Interestingly, while women were still allowed to own an establishment that dispensed alcoholic beverages, they were required to hire a man to tend the bar. And should a woman be caught tending bar, the penalty was set at $50, or nearly $1,100 today for the first offense. Do it a second time and that could result in a jail sentence. Well, clearly such a law wouldn't be tolerated today. They were fairly common back then. I did some checking, and by 1960, 26 states banned women from tending bar, as did a significant number of smaller localities. One attempt to challenge these laws took place in Dearborn, Michigan in the 1940s. After Valentine Gossard's husband died, she and her daughter Margaret wished to run the family tavern, but state law forbid a woman from doing so unless she was, quote, the wife or daughter of the male owner, unquote. Well, the problem is, in this case, the male owner was deceased. Now, the Michigan law, interestingly, only applied to cities with populations of 50,000 or more. It didn't apply to any town or city that was smaller. So along with 24 other women, Gossard sought to have the state law overturned, arguing that it robbed women of their livelihood. The case made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1948, in a 6-3 ruling, the court ruled against Gossard. In justifying their decision, the court said that the U.S. Constitution didn't require state legislatures to reflect changing social values. In addition, and here's the sexist part, they pointed out that ownership of a drinking establishment by a husband or father, it protected women from the social and moral risks that they face while tending bar. Of course, times do change, and after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, women began to challenge the laws that forbid them from tending bar. So here's some stats. By 1970, 21.2% of bartenders were female. It more than doubled to 44% by 1980, that's just a decade later, and more than half, 52%, were female in 1990. As for today, it's estimated that 60% of all bartenders in the United States are female. And I think this story is my favorite today. Niccolo Scotti was like so many other American immigrants. He was born in Italy on September 27th of 1894. He sailed from Naples at the age of 18, arriving in New York aboard the SS Princess Irene on May 16th of 1913. Nick settled in San Pedro, California, where he would spend the bulk of his adulthood working as a fisherman, longshoreman, and restaurant cook. Along the way, he married Estorina Saletti, and the couple adopted a daughter named Nancy. Just hard work, a good family, and a nice retirement. It's not exactly the kind of thing that gets one into the news. Well, shortly after his wife Esther passed away in 1976, Nick began planning a trip back to the land of his birth. Now in his early 80s, he felt this may be the last time he'd be healthy enough to visit his sisters, nieces, and nephews back in Italy. But things didn't go as planned. When his plane landed on Monday, August 8th of 1977, he tripped as he stepped off the airplane. In doing so, he re-injured a knee that had been bothering him since he had surgery on it many, many years before. That was when he was working as a longshoreman. Nick expected to be met at the airport by his nephews, but they were nowhere to be found. So staff of the airline, that's Trans World Airlines or TWA, they decided it was best to have doctors look at his injured knee. So they arranged for an ambulance and he was taken to a nearby hospital. TWA then notified his daughter back in San Pedro and she frantically tried to call a hospital. She said,
"I put in 12 calls to the hospital trying to find out what was happening. I was put off time and time again. Nobody seemed to know what was going on, and they kept asking me to call back. My dad is fine in his own surroundings. He cooks and works around the house, but he gets confused in a strange place, and I didn't want him to get lost. I finally contacted a social worker at the hospital and was told to call back and his release would be arranged. When I did call back, I was told he had already been released and put on a bus to the airport."
And that's where things went haywire. While he didn't know his nephew's address, he figured this is his native homeland and he'd be able to track them down fairly quickly. So he left the airport and began to wander the city looking for them. But as Nick roamed the streets, he didn't recognize anything from his youth. The Roman landmarks, the Roman ruins, they were gone. But not everything was unchanged. For example, he noticed that residents grew zucchini and tomatoes in their backyards, just as he remembered from when he was a kid. For most of Monday and nearly all day Tuesday, he searched in vain. He traveled endlessly on the buses, but had absolutely no luck. Eventually, a bus driver noticed that Nick had been riding the bus for hours and sought the help of police officer Gerald D'Angelo. The problem was that D'Angelo, while of Italian heritage, didn't speak a word of Italian. And Nick, since he was in unfamiliar surroundings, was having a tough time speaking in English. Whoa, hold up. What's going on here? Something's a bit off. Why would a policeman in Italy not speak Italian, and why would Nick need to speak in English while in Italy? I mean, even the bus driver or any passenger on the bus should have been able to talk to him in Italian. Well, the problem was, and you may have guessed this, Nick wasn't in Italy. When his TWA plane landed at New York's Kennedy Airport for a 1-hour layover, Nick thought he was in Italy and he got off the plane. The hospital that he was taken to wasn't in Rome. Instead, he was at Jamaica Hospital in Queens. And when they released him, he began wandering the streets of Queens. He was buying food at pizzerias and also wondering why the Italians had ripped down all of those Roman ruins. It wouldn't be until 5:45 the following evening that Nancy got a call from New York City Police Detective John Hammond letting her know that her dad was indeed all right. She told reporters,
"The police said he had traveler's checks and plenty of money, but that his leg was hurting. They offered to put him back on a plane to Rome, but I said no, they'd better send him home until his leg was better." Detective Hammond, his partner George Baker, and Officer Gerald D'Angelo made all the arrangements. Got him a plane ticket, arranged for a wheelchair, and put him on a plane for Los Angeles Wednesday morning, and I picked him up at the airport. Thank God for those police officers. They are just terrific.
And once back home, Nick expressed his desire to get to Italy soon, but his daughter, she squashed that idea.
Not this year, but if the good Lord is willing, perhaps next.
So did Nick Scotti ever get back to Italy? Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. He passed away nearly 4 years later in San Pedro on May 2nd of 1981. He was 86 years old. So occasionally I'm asked why the domain for my website is uselessinformation.org and not uselessinformation.com. And the answer really comes in two parts. First, when I started the Useless Information website back in 1994, very few individuals owned their own domain. Honestly, I didn't even know you could do such a thing back then. Then one day I got an email from one of my students, Eric Johansson, who was living in Seattle at the time, and he asked me what my address was. And of course I was puzzled why he wanted my address, but I had known him for years and I really wasn't too concerned and sent him the information. Well, a few days later, a letter arrives in the mail, and he had purchased the uselessinformation.org domain for me, and of course I've been using it ever since. As for why I've never gotten the uselessinformation.com domain, well, that's really simple. Back then, someone had already purchased it, and while it has come up for sale over the years, honestly, it's just too costly to justify its purchase. Which leads me to a question that I have for you today. What was the most expensive domain ever? Now, you probably don't know the answer, so here's a hint. It is the name of a city that's famous for its tourism. Well, as always, I'll let you ponder over that for a bit, and I'll let you know the answer at the end of this podcast.
Thank you. Say, Bill Goodman, what are those notes you have scrawled there? Looks like feeding of babies?
Well, it's babies and older folks, too, Bob. I'd like to talk for a minute about evaporated milk. For years, most every mother has known how valuable evaporated milk is for babies and for old people, too. But I'd like to point out that evaporated milk has an outstanding advantage in making so many wonderful foods. Things like homemade candy, pumpkin pie, cake frosting, for instance. Many kinds of main dishes turn out smoother, creamier. You see, evaporated milk has all the great food values of whole milk. Protein, vitamins, and minerals, especially calcium. The difference is that evaporated milk has about half the water removed. And thrifty homemakers everywhere know that evaporated milk is a money saver. This great dairy product is mighty convenient, too. You'll want to keep evaporated milk on your pantry shelf to use when you need extra milk for cooking and when you've unexpected guests to feed. Discover what wonderful, smooth, delicious eating your family can enjoy when you cook with evaporated milk.
So did you catch where he said protein? Of course, we say protein today, at least we do here in the United States. But as I go back and listen to these old-time radio commercials, which I've been doing over the last 18 years, you hear the pronunciation of protein quite a bit. Just another example of how language changes over time. Anyway, that commercial by the American Dairy Association for evaporated milk was from the November 13th, 1953 episode of The Bob Hope Show. Of course, he's one of the most famous comedians ever, and his show was one of the longest-running radio programs of the golden age of American radio. It aired from 1935 all the way through to 1955. His special guest on this particular episode was actor Burt Lancaster. I must admit at first it seemed a bit odd to me that the American Dairy Association would spend so much money to run an advertisement for evaporated milk, but of course I'm looking through the lens of a modern consumer. Now that everyone has refrigeration, there really isn't much need for evaporated milk. The product is exactly what it says. It's fresh milk that's heated up to remove 60% of the water, and then it's sealed in a can or some other type of modern packaging to preserve its freshness. Of course, that makes it shelf stable, and it'll last for months or even years, and to use it, all you do is remix it with the proper amount of water, and that makes a safe and reliable substitute for milk. I have to tell you, however, it's not the kind of milk I'd want to drink. I don't want a cold glass of condensed milk with my cookies. But, of course, it is excellent for cooking with. Now, the reason you don't want to drink it is that the high heat that's used in making the condensed milk, it causes it to take on a slightly caramelized flavor. Plus, if you look at it, it's slightly brown. The color darkens. Personally, I have little use for it. And that's because it's very easy to purchase fresh milk today, and if there's anything left in the container when I'm done cooking, I simply drink it. I do, however, use sweetened condensed milk in some of my dessert recipes, and sweetened condensed milk is a totally different product. When they say sweetened, they mean it. They add a lot of sugar to it, and that acts as a preservative. But once again, I wouldn't want to drink it. Yuck. Next up, I have 5 footnotes to history, and these are stories that require no further research, so I'm just going to read them word for word as they were originally published. And our first story is from the August 28, 1903 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and this appeared on page 3. The headline on this one is John H. Dadman and his wonderful lobster claw violin. After years of patient work, John H. Dadman of 429 Berkeley Street, Camden, has produced one of the most unique violins. It is made of a single gigantic lobster claw, the largest on record, its owner says. He ought to know, for he made a close study of this crustacean all his life and his father before him. Mr. Dadman has records of all the extraordinary large lobsters caught off the New England coast. None thus far have surpassed the monster from which the lobster claw violin has been constructed. The lobster from which the claw was taken was caught off Gloucester, Massachusetts in March 1862. It made a roundabout journey with a carload of fish to Concord, where Mr. Dadman, always on the lookout for such things, discovered it. It weighed 17 pounds. The single claw weighed 5¼ pounds. The claw is 13¼ inches long, 7 inches broad, and 3¼ inches thick. And for those of you who use the metric system, that's 7.7 kilograms overall. The claw weighed 2.4 kilograms. It was 34 centimeters long, 18 centimeters across, and 8 centimeters thick. Soon after securing the claw, Mr. Dadman cleaned out the meat and from time to time has worked on it until he has produced, after infinite patience, an instrument that for sweet, mellow tones can hardly be surpassed. During an interesting talk about the instrument, Mr. Dadman yesterday said,
"Some years ago it occurred to me that a violin might be made of the claw, seeing that it had possible dimensions as well as a very remarkable fine contour. I had an ambition to make it or spoil it, and after much time and much patience, I have succeeded in making it. At first it had a sweet tone, but too soft to help an orchestra much. However, it was a greater wonder than as a mere lobster claw. I have recently made 2 important changes in its fittings and settings which has improved it very much. The violin will speak for itself in proper hands."
Mr. Dadman is, besides a connoisseur of the lobster family, an author of no mean ability. He is also a collector of rare books, having in his library some printed shortly after the invention of movable type. He has been a reader of the Inquirer for many years. Which leaves me with one final question. Does that lobster claw violin still exist? Our second story appears on the front page of the Great Falls Leader on March 11th of 1927. The headline on this one is, "Town Sees Plane for the First Time. It Just Ain't." Denver, March 11th, Associated Press. When 2 members of the Colorado National Guard flew over the Continental Divide to snowbound Silverton Tuesday and gave that town its first glimpse of an airplane, they helped to produce a remark comparable to that of a farmer upon seeing a camel. Nearly all the residents of Silverton turned out to see the Douglas observation plane when it arrived from Denver. Mrs. Mary Cura, 75, refused at first to even look at the plane, for she didn't believe men could fly. Finally, she was coaxed out of the house. She took one look at the soaring plane and limped back to her rocking chair with the words, quote, "It just ain't," unquote. Next up, we have a story that appeared on page 3 of the Brooklyn Times-Union on April 2nd of 1936. The headline on this one is, "Robbers Outsmart Monkey at Holdup. Money tossed to pets seized by apartment bandits." Despite the best effort of a monkey to thwart the thieves, 9 men and women guests of Louis Ferraro in his apartment on the 3rd floor of 43 Bond Street were victims of 3 bandits last night. They lost about $400 in cash and $300 in jewelry. Adjusted for inflation, they lost about $9,150 in cash and $6,850 worth of jewelry. The monkey has been in the possession of Ferraro, a produce merchant at Gansevoort Market, Manhattan, for a year or more. He was in the room when the 3 armed bandits entered. Ferraro, sensing a holdup, quickly tossed $345. That's around $7,900 today. He tossed $345 in the direction of the monkey. The pet was about to grasp the bills when one of the trio clutched him. The man was severely bitten on the hand. He hurled the monkey to one side and picked up the cash, while his companions ordered the women and men in the place to turn over their money and jewelry. For Mrs. Diana DePerry and her husband Joseph of 117 East 7th Street, Manhattan, the thieves took $18 in cash, that's around $410 today, and Mrs. DePerry's diamond engagement ring. The thieves locked up the guests in the bathroom and left. It had to be a pretty big bathroom to hold 9 people. Wonder if they locked the monkey inside also. Story number 4 is from the front page of the August 1st, 1941 edition of the Reno Gazette-Journal. The headline reads, Freak Mishap Wounds Youth, Trousers Discharge His Rifle. New London, Connecticut, August 1st, Associated Press. Herbert Brewster, 17, was wounded by a bullet from a .22 caliber rifle which was discharged by a pair of trousers. Explaining the freak mishap, Patrolman Carlos Stone said that young Brewster, disrobing for bed last night, tossed his trousers toward a chair. His aim was poor, the officer said. The trousers struck the rifle, hung on the bedroom wall as an ornament, and it went off in falling. Attendants at a hospital here reported that Brewster was wounded in the chest 4 inches above the heart and described his condition as serious but not critical. And finally, we have a story from November 9th of 1967. This appeared on page 13 of the Miami News Record. The headline reads, Own Electrocution for Electric Chair. Gibsonton, Florida, Associated Press. The hot seat that Samuel Luther Klonk kept in his auto parts shop as a conversation piece has fried. The real electric chair, functional when it sat in the Eddyville, Kentucky State Penitentiary many years ago, caught fire and all that is left are the buckles to the large leather straps. The chair sat in the shop and customers like to come in and try it out, sort of. Nobody knows what fired the chair's own electrocution. And that got me thinking, if I owned an electric chair, why in the world would I plug the thing in? So early in the podcast, I'd asked you if you knew what the most expensive domain of all time was. Do you think you know the answer? Well, the answer is LasVegas.com. It was purchased by Vegas.com LLC for $90 million in 2005, although I should point out it wasn't all paid at one time. So see if you can follow this. $12 million was paid up front, then $83,000 per month for 36 months, followed by $125,000 per month for the next 60 months, and after that it went up to $208,000 per month for 36 months. Then, once June 30th of 2016 had been reached, they had the option of terminating the deal and, of course, losing the domain. But that's not what they did, so they continue to pay $208,000 per month, and they'll own it free and clear in the year, you ready for this? They'll own it free and clear in the year 2040. So if you add up all that cost over all those years, it comes out to somewhere around $90 million. If you're curious as to what the largest all-cash deal was for a domain, that was Voice.com. It was sold to Block.one for $30 million in 2019. They plan to use their new domain to launch a new blockchain-based social media platform that they called Voice. Now, I did check out the website, and here we are some 6 years later, and all you get is a single page with the Voice logo on it. It doesn't seem to do anything. So I guess time will tell if that $30 million investment, if it pays off or not. Before I sign off, I just want to mention I'll be giving a free talk at the Hibernian Hall in Albany, New York on Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. It is open to the public and it's totally free, although a donation to the organization is certainly appreciated, but of course it's not required. I chose 6 really good stories to share with the audience, and nearly all of them are older stories from the podcast, although I should add I'd probably only be able to get through 3 or 4 of them in the hour that I've been scheduled to talk for. So if you live anywhere near Albany, New York, and are free during the evening of March 26th, please stop by. I'd love to see you. And I guess I should mention that the Hibernian Hall is located at 375 Ontario Street. It's just a short distance from the University of Albany's downtown campus and Washington Park. Very easy to get to. I should also add that you know how hard it is to park in downtown Albany. Well, they have a parking lot, and that is totally free to park in, so don't worry about that. Now, I recently learned that I've been asking people to subscribe to my podcast on whatever podcast app you may be listening to the show on. I've been doing that for years. Well, it turns out I've been using outdated terminology. I'm supposed to be suggesting that people follow the show, not subscribe to it. And the reason for this is that subscribing implies some sort of payment or subscriptions required, which is not true. On the other hand, by saying follow the show, that makes it clear that the podcast is totally free. So if you haven't done so yet, please follow the show and you'll be notified when a new episode becomes available. The Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Anyway, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.